Okay, everyone, welcome to this RESTES. We're really happy to welcome Dr. Ramzi Merabet today. He's a lecturer in EAP and Intercultural Studies here at the University of Leeds. He's recently completed a PhD titled Belonging, Being and Interculturality, a narrative exploration of the experiences endured by students labeled international in a British university, which is a very long title, Ramzi. Ramzi's research interests comprise critical intercultural studies, internationalization of higher education and students' experiences. He's working on multiple projects informed by his recent research, recently released episodes on his podcasts, and we'll put the link in the chat. It's also on the Bali webpage. Which is a series that aims to make critical interculturality accessible to academics in higher education. And so, as you will see, and you will have worked out from his abstract, there's a lot of Ramzi's research that is very relevant to the field of EAP, and that should really trigger a lot of discussions. So Ramzi, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for attending. Yes, straight from the beginning, you can see in the title the word endured. So experiences endured by students labeled international rather than international students' experiences. I don't want to take it for granted, and I will be using this presentation today to call for not taking for granted the fact that there is an international student experience and that it is just a neutral expression. In fact, the label itself, international, is really problematic, and the experience itself, most of the time, if not all of the time, is an endured experience because it's not constructed by the students, but rather it is an experience that they encounter once they are in the UK. So I just wanted to explain the title, which is basically the summary of the talk. And you'll be surprised now looking at the bomb, really, from Lockheed Martin. So this is a picture from Lockheed Martin website. And Lockheed Martin is a company that produces defense and military equipment, including bombs, basically. This is the Paveway 2+, which is a laser-guided bomb. And alongside the picture, there is some form of marketing language, raising the bar for low-cost, precision-guided bombs. So getting the best technology for the cheapest price. But how does this relate to the talk, really? So I looked into this while reading Dark Academia by Peter Fleming, and Peter refers to an incident that happened in Yemen, I think in 2015 or 2016, where a family house was bombed at some point, and it was mistakenly bombed using a laser-guided bomb. Yeah, surprisingly, Raytheon, which basically produced the bomb, has a kind of research contract with the University of Massachusetts. So together they created the Raytheon UMass Lowell Research Institute. What is surprising is that we reached a stage where University of Massachusetts is actually using this kind of project to say that they excel at research excellence. So they boost their numbers and they boost their ranking based on the research and development they do in this field. And this is what I would call the peak of neoliberalism, basically. It's a state where universities do not question ethics anymore. And you can see from the very beginning that the talk is going to be a bit controversial regarding the purpose of universities in the first place and the purpose of what we are doing here. Okay, so just a brief summary of what is happening in UK higher education right now. So UK higher education is increasingly adopting a neoliberal rationality that challenges the very idea of public good. So you cannot simply look at universities nowadays and say, oh, it's a force for public good only. You might find instances when it is a force for public good, but there are many things that raise a lot of questions. In particular, knowledge provision, for example, is recast as a service and educators as service providers. And I will be building on this discussion later on. Higher education institutions looked at as business enterprises, obsessed with income, growth, and outputs. I'm not sure if you have already sat through a meeting where you're being told about income, or you're being told about the numbers and whether we are doing well or not doing well. So it basically begs the question, so what's the purpose of higher education in the first place? Similarly, there is this kind of student as consumer approach, which is gaining momentum. So students being looked at as consumers, as people who are purchasing a degree rather than studying a degree, for example. There is a market-driven higher education, very, very competitive, sometimes brutally competitive, and it is what Fleming would call an educational factory, basically. And what contributes to this is the increasing gap between management and academia. So in many cases nowadays, you will ask people, okay, so where does tuition fee go? Like, can you tell me how it is used around the university? And people will be telling you, oh, I don't know, I have no idea how the money is being used, for example. There are some decisions around partnerships, decisions about research directions that are decided by management. And this gap is increasing. And I would argue the more the gap increases, the more uncertainties we would have. And we are slowly losing higher education as an idea in the first place. So what I do in my research, I basically look at 3 research directions. So today I will be basically only touching on each of these directions. Well, the first one is to question labels. So why are they used? Why do we use labels in academia? If you're in the UK setting, again, you will notice that we use labels a lot, that we have a lot of labels around us. But are they useful? I'm not sure. For me personally, I would say no. Also, my research, another part of my research challenges the positivist approaches to culture and intercultural contact. I find that there is some form of interplay between labels, culture, and neoliberalism. That's why I cannot separate the 3, basically. So whenever I talk about neoliberalism, I cannot discard culture or labels, because culture is used in university to other people, or to create a state of difference, basically, or state of alienation that affects people's ability to belong to the place in the first place. And third, to openly warn against neoliberalism in academia and hyper-internationalization. So, and this is thanks to the safety I feel in the language center in the first place, that I can question neoliberalism. I can call out practices that could be problematic, or that could lead us to directions that are not the best directions, really, which I would call the pseudo holy trinity of UK higher education, basically labels, culture, and neoliberalism. Okay, so some bits and pieces about the state of UK higher education with regards to international student recruitment, which would be basically the core of this talk. So with the latest data, which the one I have access to is 2021-2022 academic year, we have around 679,000 international students who are enrolled in UK higher education institutions. And this is around 25% higher compared to 2016 and 17. So when you look at the numbers, you will see that there is a gradual increase. Arguably, the numbers will start decreasing at some point in the next 2 to 3 years for a variety of reasons. In total, we have 2.8 million students enrolled in UK universities. So we have around 24% who are considered as international. In the past, we used to have an EU status, EU students and international students. Nowadays, the EU students are suddenly basically regarded as international because of Brexit. And surprisingly, 24%, or I would say unsurprisingly, 24% of international students contribute 42% of the total tuition fees generated by higher education institutions. So while they are minority in terms of numbers, they are kind of almost a majority in terms of contribution to the UK higher education sector. These are some numbers. Basically, the net economic benefit of hosting international students in the UK. So in 2015, 2016, the net benefit was 20 billion. And in 2021, 2022, the net benefit is 37 billion. But this could be just a number for you. You know, you will see 37 billion, you'll say it's just a number. How can we measure that, basically? So to put that in context, the net economic benefit of hosting international students equates to 81% of the UK's defense budget, basically. So the UK's defense budget is 45.9 billion, and the net economic impact of international students is 37 0.4 billion. So we are not talking about a sector that doesn't generate money. We're talking about a sector that basically can generate as much money as big and key sectors in the UK. And although international students are bringing in a lot of money, they are still seen as a threat in a way. So I'm sure that you came across some articles about Suella Braverman in the past, announcing new limits on overseas students bringing family to the UK. And it's a shame, but also it created a bigger problem. It created a bigger narrative that we need to look at carefully. Because when people started challenging this on social media, so for example, Universities UK decided to take this to social media and challenge it, they basically challenged it only based on these numbers. They just used the numbers. They said that international students bring this amount of money. Why are we limiting their access to the UK? And that begs the question, is that the only thing then? Is that the only reason why we are allowing international students to come to the UK? Is that what internationalization is about then? And you can see a map, an interactive map where there are numbers. So the contribution in each area of the UK. And then when you look at the comments as well, you can find that the majority of people are justifying international students' presence or existence only based on what they bring in terms of numbers, basically. When you link that to policy documents, so there are many policy documents that deal with international students in the UK. So some policy documents are created by the Migration Advisory Committee, others by, for example, Kaplan International, London Economics, HEPI, and so on and so forth. So I looked at these reports, which are usually long with a lot of numbers. And whenever international students are mentioned, they're just mentioned in relation to their economic contribution. There isn't like another form of existence, basically. Whenever the international student is there, there should be a reference to economy, to numbers, to contribution to the experience of the home student. And rightly so, looking at Alan Manning, who is the chair of the Migration Advisory Committee's quote, which is in the foreword of the report, saying, there is no doubt that international students offer positive economic benefit, including cross-subsidizing the education of domestic students and research. And again, that begs the question, is that why do we have international students? Are we just having them because we have a sector that is basically struggling financially and we just need them to fill in that gap? Are we actually an international university in the first place, or are we an international sector in the first place? Same narrative being used in other reports. So in London Economics, saying international students bring enormous financial benefits to every corner of the United Kingdom, basically. So, well, the point is that you can look at those reports yourself, and what you will find out, you'll find out that there is always obsession with numbers. Whenever there is an international student, there is always an obsession with what they bring in terms of money, and that's about it. So at some point in the past, I think 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a new graduate route visa for international students. So once they graduate, they can apply for a job and stay in the UK for around 2 to 3 years, depending on their degree. When that was communicated, it was communicated as success for students, that universities basically were trying their best to create opportunities for international students post-graduation. But when you look into the reports, you find that it's the government decision to basically allow students to stay post-graduation for 2 to 3 years simply because there were better offers in other countries. And because there were better offers in other countries, the UK became less competitive, and it started becoming like more appealing by creating better opportunities for international students. So even decisions around whether somebody can bring in their family members or not, whether somebody can stay to work, whether somebody can stay in the first place, are not dictated by looking after the students and what they want as people, as humans. It's actually completely dehumanized in the sense that it's whether we are competitive enough. And if we are not, then we need to offer something competitive, basically. This is an extract of a statement by the Minister of State for Universities and Science, addressing attendance of the 2016 Universities UK Conference. At the time, the Minister of State for Universities and Science used to be Joe Johnson. And the statement is on the left side, just part of it. So the contribution that international students, as Julia said in her remarks, make to the UK's world-class universities is important. And we want our universities to continue to attract the best and brightest students from around the world, those who will be able to benefit from their studies here, contribute to the experiences of domestic students, strengthen the UK economy, and build valuable and lasting bridges around the world. And similar kind of statements when looking at reports as well, when looking at the media and how they position international students. In most cases, international students are seen as an object of knowledge, an object of cultural capital and or personal development for the local subject, as a source of money rather than an equal partner in a reciprocal engagement. So from the very beginning, there is this hierarchy between the labels, between being home and being an international student, basically. So we really need to reconsider what we mean by internationalization then. And one of the things that I'm suggesting in a paper that I submitted recently is to revisit internationalization and to openly say why we are internationalizing in the first place. So one of the widely quoted definition or combination of definitions in the literature around internationalization is that it is the process of integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose, functions, or delivery of post-secondary education to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. But in fact, what I'm suggesting as a new definition for internationalization is a process that strives to systematically exploit non-UK domiciled students by mobilizing nationality as a marker of inherent difference, maintaining a state of differential treatment, subscribing to deficit narratives, and exploiting students financially to prevent the collapse of neoliberal educational institutions. I wouldn't be exaggerating today if I say that if the UK loses around 10 to 15% of its international students, then many universities will collapse basically in a matter of days. Okay, so just to put some context around the experience of international students or students labeled international. Students labeled international basically go to the UK through a border. So they go through a border and most of them will probably go through the all other passports area. So from the very beginning, there is an assumption. So this is one of the pictures that one of my research participants in my doctoral research shared, is that there is an assumption from the very beginning that all other passports are completely different than UK EU passports in a way. They go through testing in order to prove their abilities, their competence, and so on and so forth. So this is an extract from my IELTS exam actually. They have to basically get a residence permit, and that residence permit has a deadline. So they know from the very beginning that their presence is temporary. They have restrictions, a lot of restrictions around how many hours they can work. Again, the hierarchy comes into question, comparing home and international students and whether there are restrictions or not as well. There is no recourse to public funds as well. So during COVID, I know that many people struggled financially simply because they are labeled international, they cannot get any support during COVID. Many of them had to drop out. Many of them have had to go home, for example. They have to do some weird stuff as well. So this was discontinued, but this is what I used to do in the past. So whenever I do something in my life, I have to go to a police station to tell the police that I'm doing that, basically. So if I move to another address, I have to go to the police and tell them. If I basically get married, you can see that the marital status is changed. If I get married, I have to tell the police that I got married. If I leave the country for more than 2 months, I have to tell the police that I'm leaving the country, basically. So there's a sense of alienation from the very beginning, and the first encounter with the UK as a place to presumably just belong, like in other place, is full of these kind of bits that make the person feel like an other in a way. Of course, the police registration was discontinued last year, which is nice, which is good. But yeah, there are still many other restrictions that prevent people from integrating in a way. And one of the questions we have in higher education all the time is like, why are we struggling with making international students belong, for example? Why are we struggling with them, making them feel part of a community? But we don't even know all of these things, all of these mechanisms that continuously other them, that continuously make them feel alien, basically. Some universities go to the next level and dedicate accommodations for international students and accommodations for home students. Some people might even go in their programs and have classes for international students and home students. And then we say, oh, why aren't they belonging? Well, look at all of the mechanisms that alienate them, basically. And there are some weird stuff as well that happen. So this is me again, which is something that could be encountered by any other international student. So this is me crossing the border at some point in 2022. And suddenly I was randomly detained. Why was I detained? I have no idea why I was detained. So I was arbitrarily detained in the border. I'm not sure if I would link it to being international or not, but I was the only person being detained there. And I was the only person going through all other passports. Everybody else was an EU or UK student, UK national, basically. And what struck me most there is not the fact that I was detained, is the fact that I was sitting there and people were passing by. And everybody passing by was like looking at me in a way. So like, what's wrong? What's happening? And what's happening at that point is a process of othering. Some people are actually creating an image about an other. They're visualizing an other. And at that point, I felt, am I the other in this situation? Are all these people who are able to pass very smoothly through the border through an e-gate, creating an image about me as an other, for example? So yeah, international students face all of these things, which I would call generative mechanisms. Based on my critical realist approach to research. Okay, so when you map that into the basically the fabric of the institution or of higher education in general, you find that we are in a state of double bind. You find that we are basically facing two completely different discourses simultaneously. You'll find an institutional discourse that says we are equal, we are diverse, we are inclusive. And then you find what I call the endured reality, which says completely the opposite thing, which says that we are not equal, actually. So we have differential tuition fees, differential treatment, differential processes, and so on and so forth, and many things that alienate us, basically. Most of them are based on this idea of being labeled international, basically. So yeah, these parallel realities exist institutionally side by side. And in most cases, they create what I would call performed buzzwords. So instead of having equality in the institution, we have performed equality. We could have people who are in charge of equality, we could have people in charge of diversity and inclusion, but most of the time, especially when it comes to international students, those things are quite performed, basically. And I just remembered one of the other mechanisms that is taking place just right now, which is an ongoing issue, for example, in Leeds, is that right now we have elections and we also have elections for the student union. And international students cannot apply for the executive roles because they cannot work full time. So the executive board, which represents the students, does not include international students who cannot apply for a full-time job in the UK, for example. So yeah, there are many mechanisms that alienate international students. So yeah, what I mean by a generative mechanism is just nothing more of a way of acting of a thing. So how something works, basically. I'm not assuming that there is a clear link of causation between all of these mechanisms and the status of UK higher education, but there are some correlations happening there. We can trace how this imposed state of difference or alienation is leading us into a direction within a broader kind of neoliberal higher education sector. So these generative mechanisms are exclusively attributed to and imposed on students labeled international, resulting in what I perceive to be a homogenized, but not necessarily homogeneous group of individuals. So whenever we think of the label, we should always remember that we are homogenizing students. So they are not homogeneous group of students. We are homogenizing them based on the label. So whenever we invoke the international label, we are trying to homogenize a group of individuals. And I would argue that it is in the interest of the neoliberal edufactory to sustain these imposed differences. I mean, if you say that difference is not related to nationality, then suddenly you are saying that differential fees are problematic, basically, which would basically affect the whole structure of UK higher education. So the label preserves and warrants an even treatment and capped fees. So for example, home students' fees are capped. International students' fees are not capped at all. So if there is any form of financial deficit, it can be attended to by overcharging international students, for example. And here we reach a state where international or students labeled international are construed as persons outside our idea of community and shared values, as persons who are defined into legal systems by their status as outsiders rather than as potential citizens. And Nibon here talks about this idea of exclusionary inclusion. It's like we are trying to be inclusive, but basically what we are doing, we are trying to be inclusive by creating an exclusive club. So looking at this imposed label and asking people, basically in my research, I will not focus much on the methodology, but what I did is a narrative approach. I sat with people with research PGRs, basically postgraduate researchers, and I asked them questions around being international. So instead of approaching them as international from the very beginning, I decided to approach them first and say, okay, what do you think about being international in the first place? Because when you look at the literature, like a Journal of International Students, Higher Education Studies, Language and Intercultural Communication, there's always this obsession with taking the label for granted. You know, we are doing something to international students or integrating international students or acculturating international students. But like nobody asked, nobody said like, oh, these people need that sort of thing. What people don't question is whether these students want to be labeled international or not, because they are not international before coming to the UK. They become international once they are in the UK. And we tend to forget that in research and we assume that they are international. So here asking Stella, in general, what comes to your mind or what came to your mind when I said international student? Stella said, a foreigner who pays to get the degree. It is like saying, take my money and give me a certificate. And it was a pretty straightforward answer, like linking the label to this idea of education as money or education as completely commodified or turned into a commodity, basically. Alice, as well, talking about the international label, saying, I do not think it is fair. To be honest, I really do not think it is fair because it's just not fair. When you see someone, so basically, again, you are paying for that certificate. That's what you are doing because they know that those coming from a third world country would do whatever it takes to have the certificate. It does not matter how the process or the journey is like. It is just a journey at the end. We all are aiming for that certificate. Do I think it is fair? It's not fair. I do not think it's fair, but again, we are here in a way. So there's an awareness, or there's a clear awareness that neoliberalism is in action, that people are actually paying for a degree to a certain extent. They're not just getting education. It's not just a force for public good. They are also playing a game where basically they need a degree to get some form of capital, basically. Claire here saying, I don't like it very much. Does it mean that I am foreign? Does it mean that I am here temporarily? Does it mean that I don't really belong? How do you interpret that kind of label? I mean, it's good to be around different people. It's good to have diversity, but why can't I just be like student? So why can't I just label myself as student if I want to? Why do I have to make that kind of distinction or discrimination between home students or international students? And finally, the working of the label can function, like the label can function beyond the administrative markers. So this is Alex, and Alex basically is considered as a home fee paying student because he was on a refugee visa, basically. So what Alex is saying here, by virtue of my immigration status, I'm not labeled as an international student because I am resident here and my status is home-based now. But the labels go beyond this simple category or simple labels. The labels to me are more of the feelings, more of the symbolic meaning of an international. And this feeling comes from my experience into society as well. So basically here, feeling international doesn't really depend on whether the person is paying international tuition fees or not. It can even be just a feeling of alienation, a feeling of not belonging, or not being able to just identify as part of the place itself. And sometimes the label can result in deficit sentiment. So here Alice is saying, I remember whenever there is, during my first year, whenever there is a research conference or something, I always stay at the back. I do not engage in the conversation because I had that fear that people find out I do not belong, I'm stupid, I know nothing. So that prohibited me from actually taking part in conversations, which is a bit unfair. So here linking being international to this deficit sentiment. Lena elaborates on this as well, saying the very first period, because I didn't have much information, I used to be scared even to ask for help. Although I know that there are people in our school kind of really happy to provide help, but just taking that first step and go to them, asking for help or just sending an email felt something of a big deal. And I said, why did you feel this way? She said, I used to think a lot just before sending an email, maybe because of the feeling that I am a person, that I'm kind of an international student, that I would feel like home students know this. So I am an international student. If I ask the question, I'll be regarded as kind of, she doesn't know that much. I'll be like kind of judged. So what I really want to focus on here is that if somebody would look at Lena's experience in a very superficial way, they would attribute her silence to her culture. They would say that she is silent because in her culture, basically, people cannot speak, or there is a huge emphasis on authority. And then suddenly Lena turns into a product of her culture. She turns from being an agent who can construct their culture however they want into being a product of a culture. And I see this happening a lot in EAP and beyond as well, where people are seen through the lens of categories, through the lens of national cultures, basically, assuming that people would behave in a certain way just because of where they are from. And this leads us into really problematic definitions of culture. So although we had years of questioning and debunking the myth of cultural fundamentalism, the fact that we have some cultural programming of the mind that tells us what we do or that determines our behavior, we are still suffering with the same issue over and over again. I cannot go through a semester without hearing things that relate culture to behavior. For example, here, I didn't want to attach it in my slides to not be hit with copyright infringement or whatever. So this is an IATF Voices issue, which is issue 296. And there is an article here saying, questioning the cultural divide in Japan. And it's from someone who basically spent a lot of time in Japan, but for some reason still believes that Japanese students are not questioning things because of their Japanese culture. Just because they are Japanese, they're not able to question things. They're not able to be critical in a way, which I find really problematic. And this is all based on this idea of culture, a Hofstadian idea of culture, which is completely positivist, and which assumes that culture is a programming of the human mind by which one group of people distinguishes itself from another group. So although this is really, really problematic, I mean, even students at undergraduate level, first year undergraduate level, can question this easily. We are still relying on this whenever we look at international students. We look at them not just as people, we look at them as representatives of national cultures. So the problems also get worse when the label is mobilized against students. In a way, when there is a cultural reality that is imposed on students without even looking at how students basically construct themselves in the first place. So here Alice is narrating an experience with what she called racism. So Alice says, I experienced racism at university in the invigilation. It happened twice, actually, and I just remembered that. One with the lead invigilator, an old person. Basically, we were invigilating, and by the end, he was holding the papers all by himself in addition to a bag. I had a conversation with him before, and he knows where I come from. I said, can I help you with the papers? And he was like, no, thanks. Oh, I know you, the Berbers, are used to carrying heavy things. I was just biting my tongue. You, the Berbers, are used to carrying heavy things. As if I am a donkey then. I was doing it out of politeness because he is an old person. The second time happened recently. My name is, and she mentioned her name, which is a distinctive Arab name. There was another invigilator who was talking to international students. Not international students, they were home students. But she thought they were international. She was urging them to come to the room. But because of the exam, I understood why they were stressed. So they were just looking at her like oblivious. And she came back and told me, you know what? Most of these students are international. They don't even speak English. So you see the link here between being international and not speaking English. One invigilator said, are they Chinese? And then another layer of imposing some form of reality just based on nationality, basically. She said, no, they look Arab to me. And then she mentioned her name and she said, oh, that's where you come in handy. Just because she had an Arab name, she assumed that she would be able to speak with every Arab person in the world, basically. She didn't even talk to me. She just saw my name. And then when the students came in, most or all of them, I could hear the accents. They were speaking English with British accents. And most of them seemed to have Asian background, like Indian or Pakistani, but most of them were actually British citizens. She said real name, which is her real name, which is a distinctively Arab name. That's where you come in handy because they looked Arab. And she didn't even talk to me. She was just like, hi, what's your name? It's that. And I was like, wow, really, really. So here, once we start looking at the workings of the label or the workings of what we associate with the label as well, with what we associate about students who come from certain nationalities, we realize that we are constantly othering students based on nationality. And then that begs the question again, why are we doing that? Why are we using the label in the first place? Experiences also happen. I have many experiences, but I'm being very selective with the experiences. So this is another experience by Hyam, which happened outside the university. So this idea of imposed labels or imposed othering happens everywhere, basically. It doesn't just happen within the context of the university. So Hyam here says, when I moved in, I had some serious issues with the house for which I have sent a serious tone email to the agency. Among the problems I had was turning on the heating, and I have told them that it would have been better if one of the agents had accompanied me to show me how things work, like in my previous tenancy. On the reply and email received, which I received a copy of as well, but I'm not showing that today here, the agent told me something which I found offensive. She told me that these things are super clear to run unless I'm not English, and things where I come from work differently. I mean, she could have just apologized for the inconvenience, and that's it. She just didn't have to be that rude in her response. This was part of an email, a Teams interview. That's why the word rude is capitalized, because it was capitalized by Huyam herself, basically. But yeah, do you see this idea of like when we approach people as representative of national cultures, we start using all of those grand narratives that we have about a national culture. It could be collectivism, individualism, power distance index, Islam, Orientalism, or whatever. And we start seeing students or those labeled international through the lens of those grand narratives. That's why in EAP, for example, I come across many narratives that link criticality to nationality and assume that being a national of a particular country means that you are not critical enough. And what happens there is that it's not the student's fault. Most of the time, it's actually the person unable to see beyond the grand narrative. There is a grand narrative at play that says that people from certain places are individualist and other places are collectivist. And if you're not able to question that in the first place, you will obviously end up othering all of the students in your classroom. So yeah, this quote from Sewell summarizes what is happening in a very lovely way. Here, Sewell is saying that the typical cultural strategy of dominant actors and institutions is not so much to establish uniformity as it is to organize difference. They are constantly engaged in efforts not only to normalize or homogenize, but also to hierarchize, encapsulate, exclude, criminalize, hegemonize, or marginalize practices and populations that diverge from the sanctioned ideal. By such means, authoritative actors attempt, with varying degrees of success, to impose certain coherence onto the field of cultural practice. So what students or what the participants that I just mentioned the narratives of are experiencing here is a state of organized difference. Their difference is being organized without their consent, without them even agreeing for their difference to be organized in a way. So by establishing who is part of us, we are also indirectly establishing who is them. By establishing who is same, we are also identifying who is different as well. In this case, through using the international label, we're basically alienating students from the very beginning, not even allowing them to question who they are in the first place. And that leads us to a little summary, basically. Um, I think that if we really need to look at research with international students or teaching international students or looking at sustainable internationalization in general more seriously, then we need to first think beyond national markers and prescriptive labels. I mean, the same case doesn't happen with home students, for example. They are assumed to be different regardless of where they come from in the UK, for example. When it comes to international students, they're assumed to be different because they are international, because they come from a different nationality, which is really problematic. So whenever we think about international students, we should really think about students labeled international. We should remember that we are labeling the students. They are encountering the label when they come here, rather than come with a label with them, basically. So the label is not a marker of difference. It is an imposed state of being. The label is not a mark of a constructed identity, but rather an imposed state of being. Why do we assume that students are happy to be labeled international in the first place? So many of the research that you can find in journals that deal with international students, you can easily question whether why are you assuming that these are international students, and what goes into that assumption, basically. Well, we need to also look at realities beyond the scope of construction. Agency is sometimes inaccessible. So if you come to the UK and you're met with a border that alienates you from the very beginning, you have restrictions on your work, you have restrictions on access to public funds, you have restrictions within the classroom. Sometimes you encounter a teacher who will tell you from the very beginning, hello, how are you, what's your English name? You're encountering many mechanisms that other you constantly, and your agency is suddenly restricted. Sometimes you decide to challenge that. That's what I did in the research. Other times you just accept it and move on, you know? You just other yourself, basically. And that's when people mistake self-othering for deficit. They think that people basically are deficient in some way, while actually what they're doing is just self-othering. They just want to go on with their lives. And the moment we start to look at students beyond labels is the same moment we start not only performing EDI, but actually realizing some form of EDI, basically equality, diversity, and inclusion, basically. So far, as Rachel Burke said in a publication, is that international students are outside the realm of educational equality. Whenever we think about educational equality, we never have initiatives that include international students. Suddenly they are outside that perimeter of educational equality. And since they are outside that perimeter, they are not being catered for. Therefore, all forms of EDI that supposedly deal with international students are actually just performed, basically. Okay, so far, some people would just come and say, oh, well, these are just, they're not citizens, they shouldn't be treated as citizens. There's a strong argument out there, and people would approach it from that perspective, saying, oh, they're no citizens, they shouldn't be getting as much protection as a citizen in terms of looking after them, in terms of educational equality. I mean, if you look at the ethical side of it, you will question this position. But still, let's assume that, okay, there is no problem. These are not citizens. We shouldn't really care that much about the fees they pay and the treatment they get and the othering they endure on the go and so on and so forth. And let's look at our own self-interest as a sector instead. So even when we look at our own self-interest, it is not in our interest to treat international students this way. It won't be in our interest in years to come. And this is probably one of the talks that says, oh, at some point in the future I will come. Hopefully not, I hope not. But at some point in the future, I see myself coming, oh, I told you that, I told you that's happening, basically. So this is a graph that shows some universities' reliance on international students. Choosing University of Coventry, which is in yellow, was on purpose. Choosing Warwick, Manchester, and King's College London was just random, basically. So you see that the graph is going up in the case of Warwick, King's College London, and Coventry. In Coventry, it's really going up at a very high rate. So what this graph shows, it shows the percentage of contribution of international students or international tuition to the UK's higher education institutions' total income. So for example, out of the total income of Coventry University, the entire income of the university, 46% of its income comes from international students, basically. When we look sector-wide, we find that also the number is going high, and now it is sitting at 22%. So sector-wide, the entire income that the sector, which hires, I think, 250,000 members of staff, is relying like at the level of 22% on international students. This is what I would call hyper-internationalization. There is an immediate correlation between that number going up and then stuff going up or down, and then stuff getting targeted redundancies, getting uncertainties around their jobs, job security concerns, and so on and so forth. So, for example, these are just selected articles. So this is from Staffordshire University. A vow to fire plans to call 1 in 10 academic jobs at Staffordshire University. This is from Lincoln, University of Lincoln, under growing financial pressure. Sheffield Hallam University invited to apply for voluntary severance. I'm sure that some of you here could be from one of these institutions, and you probably better know what is happening. Huddersfield criticized for cutting jobs during summer holidays. University of Brighton cuts 103 academic staff jobs. And Coventry, which is, I think, the peak of the crisis so far, Coventry is set to cut nearly 100 million as sector crisis bites. There is a strong correlation between dehumanizing international students and making universities completely unsustainable, basically. The more we rely on international students as a source of income, the less sustainable we become, and the more uncertainties we have, and the more emails that tell us that we are not doing well, we are not creating, we're not producing enough, the income is not good, the output is not good, basically. And then people are like wondering why, but yeah, it's this hyper-internationalization taking place that is taking us into this direction, basically. Looking at international students as numbers, using the label to differentiate home and international students, and then uncapping the fees for international students makes universities unsustainable. So even if you approach the matter from, let's say, saying like, oh, these are not citizens, we shouldn't be really giving them as much protection as citizens, what is happening is that we are basically destroying the entire sector. And this leads us to hyper-internationalization, which is something I'm introducing in a paper that I submitted recently. So hyper-internationalization is a non-sustainable process of excessive reliance on international students to the point where the decisions that inform teaching and learning are no longer based on substantial scholarship and research, but rather dictated by the financial bottom line and the suite of managerial decisions that university actors are obliged to implement to mitigate financial issues, eventually jeopardizing the main excellence and quality indicators upon which the sector is presumably leading. So this is the current state in some universities, hyper-internationalization and excessive reliance on international students, not because, so admission is no longer based on quality indicators, admission is based on whether we need to bail ourselves out or not, for example. So this is happening in some institutions. In other institutions, like big institutions, for example, like Leeds, it's not happening now, but it is happening in the future, because basically the graph is indicating that the numbers are going up. The reliance on international students as a source of income is going up and up and up, basically. And with the rise of new destinations for students, so Sweden, Finland, France, introducing a new fee structure and so on and so forth, we're not expecting the numbers of students to go up. We're actually expecting the numbers of students to go down, basically. So what would happen then? So what should we do then by then? Like, should we just cut the jobs of 30–40% of staff in the entire UK, basically? Or should we start thinking about it right now and saying, oh, I need to challenge this. I need to talk about this more often. I need to talk about neoliberalism in higher education, basically. Of course, we don't speak from a position of privilege, all of us, but we need to start questioning these things. So I created this kind of figure, basically, trying to visualize what's happening based on the numbers, based on what the reports are saying, and based on observations that I see happening in different universities around the UK. So the more we have exploitative, what I call exploitative internationalization, in a way, internationalization that just aims to get the money, the more we are basically essentializing students based on the label. We need to keep students different based on the label in order to ensure that they would pay that amount of money, basically. The more uncertainty, precarity, and redundancies we have, and also the less research and scholarship-informed pedagogy. So you might think about, oh, I want to run a session this way, and then suddenly you might get a top-down decision that tells you, oh, you cannot run that session that way. You cannot have that number of students, not because it's not relevant based on research and scholarship, but it's just because we cannot afford to do that anymore, basically. And also this jeopardizes the acceptance and admission standards. So the lowering of admission standards just to allow students to get the degree in order to pay the money and basically bail out the institutions. But this cannot continue based on the numbers. We are reaching the peak of international student recruitment. So what happens once the numbers start going down? So what can we do? I know many papers, many talks like to present problems. I mean, Dark Academia by Peter Fleming is an amazing piece if you want to vent, but by the end it just tells you what's the problem, basically. And I don't want to be that talk. I don't want to be that paper. I want to just talk about potential things we can do, basically. So this talk basically regarding neoliberal higher education. In this talk, I'm openly asking to cap international student tuition fees. And in the recent paper I submitted, I'm asking to cap international tuition fees. It's only then, we need to not look at people as numbers. We need to not look at people as money in order for us to move away from neoliberal higher education. We need to find other sources, to create other sources. We need to get support back. I know that in the UK, at least what I notice is that once financial support is pulled off by the government, it cannot return, basically. But we need to find other ways, basically. Making universities more sustainable, able to survive without exploitative internationalization, so without the need to go for hyper-internationalization or to excessively recruit students. Certainty and job security. I'm sure that many people are struggling with uncertainty in the UK. It's one of the things that probably academic staff share in the UK in different institutions. Admission and educational quality standards. So if we need to really have a serious talk about admission, about quality standards, then I think these things shouldn't be based on the numbers of students or whether we can bail ourselves out or not. And then if we cannot, then we need to lower the standards to allow ourselves to be bailed out, basically. And that eventually would lead to a humanized experience. So even if people say that, oh, we can only cater for citizens, I mean, if we follow this approach, it will eventually be a humanized experience by the end. Students being looked at as people rather than as representatives of national cultures, or rather than, I don't know, as numbers adding to a bigger pool of money. Regarding the label, so we need to examine the underpinnings of the label and what results from assuming that students are international in terms of experience. So when we assume that students are international, what happens? What are the implications in terms of experience? What are the implications in terms of treatment, in terms of policies, in terms of the discourses around students labeled international? And we need to openly challenge narratives of deficit that make use of the label to assume behavior, competence, teaching, learning approaches, and so on and so forth. I mean, you will come across, and I'm sure you came across many deficit narratives that just link criticality or lack of just to being Japanese or being Chinese or being Indian or being Arab or whatever. And there are even more accusations, basically. Some people linking academic dishonesty to being from a particular country, which is really, really problematic. And yeah, we need to unlearn the ongoing tendency to look at students as either home or international, both in research and teaching, because this is not only impacting international students, it's also impacting home students as well, because home students are also homogenized as representatives of a UK culture or something like that, which affects the experience overall. I mean, you go to the union and go to any union in the university, and you'll suddenly find that people are creating camps, like Chinese students sitting together, UK students sitting together, and so on and so forth. So why don't we challenge that in universities? Why don't we try to create spaces where people belong beyond the labels or the markers? We keep emphasizing the labels and eventually we're basically creating more difference than belonging. And what can we do regarding culture and interculturality? So in my recent doctoral research, I had to look into this, and I basically came up with a way to look at culture as a form of belonging. And this way to look at culture, I'm kind of intentionally not using model, like the word model, like cultural model, because all models are really problematic. And this is just a way to look at culture from a very complex perspective. So it is simple to understand, but it leads to a very complex image about culture, basically. And it has already been used in other research that is coming soon. So when I think of culture, the first thing I would talk about is that Ingrid Pillar says that culture is a lazy explanation. Culture is always invoked whenever people encounter difference that they don't want to understand in proper detail. So it's just a lazy card that you just throw whenever you encounter difference, basically, and you say, oh, it's because of their culture, basically. Very lazy explanation in a way. And I noticed that a lot. So, for example, this IATEFL kind of piece, I'm not criticizing the person, but I'm just criticizing the approach itself, like the fact that you look at people as representatives of national cultures and assume behavior based on their national culture, basically. It's like me looking at Brexit and assuming that everybody in the UK is racist. It's just really ridiculous way of thinking about culture, basically. Something similar happened in the recent Bali blow sick as well. I was trying not to speak about it during the event, but I had to intervene because somebody was linking criticality to country, that nationals of certain people can be critical, others cannot be critical because of their nationality, which is, again, really problematic. So this way of looking at culture aims to make it a little bit complex, aims to say that there is a lot that goes into culture. It's not just a lazy card that you invoke whenever you see a different behavior. So culture as a form of belonging is made up of three sections: assigned belonging, constructed belonging, and imposed belonging. So I will use myself as an example, basically. So I grew up in Algeria, and I didn't choose where to live. I didn't choose where to be born, basically. The place was assigned to me based on certain factors, that my family was there, basically, and I grew up in I would say a middle-class family, a middle-class, presumably Muslim family. This is my assigned belonging. There are many things that go into that, in addition to being middle class, to being born in Algeria, in the eastern part of Algeria. It could go on and on and on. There are many things that are assigned to me that I didn't choose, basically. As I started growing, I started constructing things myself. I started looking at practices. I started looking at ways of being, ways of believing, ways of doing things, which many people would consider to be culture. And I started constructing them the way I want. So I could conform to what I see out there. I could challenge what is out there. I can adapt it. I change it, for example. And this can be basically applicable to any person. You can think about any event that you have basically around you, and you realize that you do it or perform it completely differently from another person, for example. So now I grew up in a Muslim family. It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily Muslim. So for example, I'm not religious. I'm not religious, but on Christmas Day, I was in a Catholic church in Lithuania, attending the mass, because it was really interesting experience to me. So do you see now how I am constructing my belonging, constructing what I choose to be part of me, basically? And I want you to think about students themselves. Students having their own assigned belonging, the place that they grew in, what they were assigned, either by their family, either by the society, and how they constructed it differently, basically. The problems start once we start imposing belonging. So somebody, for example, like this article, would look at Japan as a culture, Japanese culture, which is something too big to basically pin down, and impose the category on the person. Instead of looking at the person as someone who is socially constructing the category and looking at it differently, maybe the person is discarding the category altogether. Maybe they are constructing it differently, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, the person is seen only through the category, that because of their culture, they are this way. And to what extent that affects the classroom, be it an EAP classroom or any other classroom, it's just beyond belief, really. Like, can you imagine that we are seeing students through the lens of an imposed belonging, that we are basically imposing something on them that they are not? I mean, we wouldn't even be able to get to know the student in the first place if we impose belonging in the first place. So yeah, that's that. This is the end of the talk. These are some questions to consider. So why do we label students international? Is it problematic? Are we alienating students through labeling them? Did you observe any effects resulting from mass internationalization within your faculty, school, department? How uncertain are you about the future of higher education? We need to start these discussions. Basically, how can we attend to these uncertainties? Is internationalization working? Can it work better? How? What's the relevance of culture in all of this? How do we mobilize culture in our classrooms and universities in general? And are there any similarities beyond the UK? Because I'm aware that this talk was completely within the UK setting itself. I think that's the end. These are the references that he used, and I hope it was meaningful in some way.
Thank you very much, Ramzi. Thank you. I'm just going to take a couple of seconds to recover. Thank you. It was really thought-provoking. The broad analysis, I think, of the funding model of higher education in the UK and its strange relation with this label. The very interesting way of considering the label as a structuring element and imposed element rather than a taken for granted characteristic of students is obviously very interesting. So we're going to open the floor to questions. But for me, I just was really thinking about what can be done, beyond advocating at campus level, but within our classrooms to treat students like this. Student's quote is really lovely. Could I just be labeled student? So, I don't know if anyone has any kind of thing to say about that. But thank you, Ramzi, and please go ahead to ask questions. I'll stop recording.